The wind had a cruel voice that spring, whistling through the prairie grass like it carried secrets no one wanted to hear. Dust hung in the air, pale as breath, and every sound seemed sharper for it. The clatter of a loose shutter, the bleat of a hungry goat, the distant creak of wagon wheels. Out on the edge of that worn land stood a cabin made from sun-bleached timber, its roof patched with hides and hope. Inside, voices rose and fell, sharp as broken glass. Lydia Holt was just 17, but there was a stillness about her, the kind that came from too many silences. She stood in the yard, her hands raw from washing, her brown hair tied back with a strip of faded calico. The goats shuffled near the fence, restless and thin. Behind her, her father's voice thundered again. John Holt, a man crushed under more seasons than he'd survived. He'd been a farmer once, proud of his soil, but the drought had stolen everything. His crops, his strength, his mercy. Her mother's cry followed, low and pleading. Lydia couldn't make out the words, but she knew what they were about. The talk had begun 2 nights ago, when the old rancher from the east, Abel Crow, had ridden in with his mule and his money and his offer. 1 good milk cow in exchange for a wife. No dowry, no fuss. A clean trade, he called it. Lydia hadn't believed it real at first. No one could be that cruel, not even her father. But here they were, arguing over her life as if it were grain to be weighed and sold. She leaned against the fence and stared at the horizon. The sky was the color of burnt brass, endless and indifferent. Somewhere out there a hawk circled, patient and alone. Lydia envied it. Her fingers dug into the wood, splinters pricking her skin. She whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. The door slammed open. Her father came out, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. He didn't look at her right away, just stared off at the dry fields where nothing grew anymore. "Lydia," he said finally, his voice rough, "come inside. We've got company." Her stomach turned cold. She followed him, every step heavier than the last. The cabin smelled of smoke and boiled roots. At the table sat Abel Crow, his hat resting beside a half-empty cup. He was older than her father by 20 years at least, his face a map of lines carved by wind and whiskey. His coat was fine wool, his boots polished, but his eyes small, gray, and wet, with a kind that measured everything in worth and weight. "Well now," Crow said, his tone smooth but sour by age. "Here's the young lady." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Prettier than I was told." Lydia stood still. Her mother, a small woman with hands always trembling, kept her gaze on the floor. John cleared his throat. Crow's made an offer. Fair one, given our trouble. He couldn't look his daughter in the eye. A cow for the family. It'll keep us fed. Lydia's breath caught. "A cow," she repeated, barely a whisper. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "It's not what we want, child. It's what we have to do." Abel Crow rose from the table and walked around her like a man inspecting a horse. He smelled of tobacco and cold iron. His boots thudded on the floorboards. "You'll come to my ranch west of Dry Creek. Big place. You'll eat well. Work some, sure, but better than starving out here." Lydia's fists clenched at her sides. "And if I say no?" Crow's laugh was soft, dangerous. "You'll say yes. Your pa already agreed." John flinched. "Girl, don't make this harder. I can't feed you no more." Lydia looked at him then, really looked. The hollow cheeks, the shaking hands, the brokenness that hunger and failure had carved into him. She wanted to hate him, but all she saw was a man already defeated. The weight of his guilt was heavier than the drought itself. She turned to her mother, hoping for rescue, but her mother's lips only moved in silent prayer. The deal was struck before sunset. Crow counted out the coins, tied the cow's rope to the post, and told them he'd send for priests in the morning. Lydia sat by the doorway, staring at the animal that had replaced her life. It chewed its cud lazily, oblivious to the bargain it had sealed. The light faded from the world, and with it, something faded inside her too. That night, she didn't sleep. The walls creaked with the wind, and every sound felt like a farewell. She heard her parents whispering, her father's voice hoarse with regret, her mother's soft sobs. Lydia pressed her hands over her ears. In her chest burned something sharp like anger, but underneath it was grief, a deep, hollow kind that felt older than she was. By dawn, the priest arrived, a weary man who'd stopped believing the vows he spoke. The ceremony took place beneath the old oak behind the cabin. Its leaves were sparse, its bark cracked and gray. A few neighbors came to watch, drawn by curiosity more than compassion. They whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others looking away. The bride wore her mother's shawl as a veil. The groom stood tall and smug, smelling of aftershave and pride. When the priest asked if she would take Abel Crow as husband, Lydia's voice barely left her throat. Her mother reached for her hand, but John's firm grip kept her still. "Say the words," he hissed under his breath. "Say them, or we're done for." She said them. The sky seemed to dim at that very moment. Abel placed a ring on her finger, a dull brass band too large for her, and kissed her cheek with dry, cracked lips. The crowd murmured. The priest muttered a blessing, and just like that, Lydia Holt ceased to exist. In her place stood Mrs. Crow, a name that felt like a noose. When they rode away, the dust swallowed the cabin behind them. Her mother's silhouette in the doorway grew smaller until it vanished altogether. Abel didn't speak much during the ride. He led the horse and whistled an old tune off-key, content and oblivious. Lydia kept her eyes on the horizon. Every mile felt like a chain tightening around her heart. They reached his ranch by nightfall. The place sat on a stretch of dry land, the kind that killed anything green. The fences leaned like tired bones, and the windmill creaked in the dark. The main house loomed against the twilight, its windows glowing faintly with lantern light. Abel dismounted, motioned for her to follow, and led her inside. The air smelled of whiskey and smoke. The furniture was heavy, old, built for comfort, not beauty. A single picture hung above the mantel, a woman's portrait, pale and still, her eyes hauntingly kind. Abel noticed Lydia staring. "That's my late wife," he said, voice flat. "Died 3 winters back. Don't go poking around her things." Lydia nodded. Her throat was too dry for words. He showed her to a small room at the end of the hall. The bed was narrow, the window nailed shut. "You'll rise early," he said. "Cook, clean, tend stock. I like things quiet." She nodded again. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. His hand lifted, brushing her cheek. The touch was rough, ownership disguised as affection. "You'll get used to it," he said. "They always do." He left her then, shutting the door behind him. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the locked window. The night outside was alive with coyotes. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled across the plains. She felt like the storm was coming for her. Hours passed. She wandered the hall, barefoot and careful. Abel's snores rattled through the walls. In a corner cabinet, she found an old wooden box. Inside was a diary bound in cracked leather. The first page was dated 3 years ago. The handwriting was neat, delicate. "If anything happens to me," it read, "it will not be an accident. He's not the man he pretends to be." Lydia's fingers trembled. She turned the page, but a floorboard creaked behind her. Quickly, she tucked the diary under her skirt and slipped back to her room. Sleep came in fits, chased away by fear. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the cow, the priest, her father's empty gaze. By morning, she was hollow-eyed but steady. Abel expected breakfast. She made it biscuits, eggs, coffee strong enough to burn the tongue. He ate without thanks, his eyes watching her the whole time. Days passed in gray rhythm. The chores filled her hands, but not her mind. She thought of escape, but the ranch was miles from the nearest town, and Abel kept the only horse saddled. Every evening he locked the doors, muttering about thieves. She began to talk to the cow in the barn, the one she'd come with. It was the only thing that didn't look at her with hunger or suspicion. "You're worth more than me," she whispered once, feeding it dry hay. "You got milk. I just got sorrow." One afternoon, while sweeping, she found the edge of a loose floorboard under the table. Beneath it, she discovered a small tin box holding a gold brooch and a folded letter. The letter was stained and torn, written in the same delicate hand as a diary. "He said he'd bury me out back," It read, "If anyone finds this, tell my brother in Dodge." Lydia's heart pounded. She knew then that Abel's wife hadn't died of sickness. That night, when Abel came home smelling of whiskey and anger, she stayed silent, pretending not to see the red on his knuckles. He muttered about trespassers, about men who owed him money. She nodded and kept her eyes down. But inside, something had shifted. The fear was still there, yes, but it had company now, a spark of defiance. 2 nights later, he came to her door again. When she didn't open it fast enough, his fist slammed against the wood. "You forget who feeds you," he snarled. She didn't answer. He unlocked it with a key and stepped inside. She stood by the window, her shoulders squared. He raised his hand, but she didn't flinch. "You're a fool," he hissed, lowering his arm. "No one out here will help you." He left her there, locked in with the smell of smoke and his lies. Lydia sank to the floor, tears burning her eyes. The cow lowed outside, lonely and restless. Through the window slats, lightning split the sky, bright and violent. She pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "I'll find a way." The wind picked up, rattling the house like it wanted to tear it apart. The storm was coming closer now, heavy with promise and threat. Lydia rose, staring into the dark, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope shaped like fury. She knew what she had to do. Somewhere beyond that storm was freedom, and this time she wasn't going to wait for anyone to grant it. The rain came hard that night, sweeping across the plains like vengeance. Lightning ripped open the sky, painting the ranch in flashes of white fire. The house shook under the wind, shutters slamming like angry fists. Inside, Abel Crow snored drunk in his chair, boots sprawled near the dying fire, a half-empty bottle resting between his knees. Lydia sat by the window, her face ghosted by the storm's light. The cow lowed in the barn, restless, as if sensing what she meant to do. She'd spent the day pretending. Cooking, cleaning, nodding when he spoke, keeping her eyes low. But her thoughts were far from obedience. They were on the diary, the letter, the late wife who'd written them. He said he'd bury me out back. The words haunted her. She'd searched that patch of ground behind the barn that morning. Found a mound too even, too deliberate. No marker, no name, just rain-hardened soil. The truth sat in her stomach like lead. The thunder cracked again, closer this time. Lydia rose, wrapping herself in a thin shawl. She had no plan, just the certainty that staying meant dying. She stepped to the hearth and took the small knife from beside the breadboard. Dull, but sharp enough. Abel stirred, mumbling something, but didn't wake. She held her breath until his snore returned, deep and steady. The storm's howl covered her footsteps as she crossed the floor. The barn door banged in the wind when she pushed it open. The cow turned its heavy head, eyes reflecting the lantern light she carried. "Hush," she whispered. "Hush, girl. It's time." She cut the rope binding the gate, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the knife. Rain swept across the yard in sheets. She hesitated only once, glancing back at the house. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a face in the upstairs window. Then the lightning faded, and it was gone. She ran. The mud sucked at her boots, her dress clinging to her legs as she stumbled into the darkness. The cold tore through her shawl, through her skin. The knife she kept clutched in one hand, a small and desperate weapon. Behind her, the storm swallowed the sound of everything. No footsteps, no pursuit, only wind. Freedom felt like terror, but she didn't stop. By dawn, the rain had turned to mist. She was miles from the ranch, her limbs numb, her breath short and ragged. The land stretched in all directions, muddy plains cut by creeks and scattered pines. She followed one, the water cold but clean, drinking in handfuls. The reflection that met her eyes was barely human, mud-smeared face, wild hair, blue lips. But the eyes still burned, faintly alive. She walked until her legs shook. Birds returned to the sky, their calls sharp and lonely. At one point she thought she heard a horse behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing but fog. Her stomach knotted with hunger. She'd left with nothing but the knife and the shawl. By noon, the sun burned through the haze, and her head throbbed with heat. She moved slower, dizzy, her feet bleeding through torn boots. That's when she heard the rattle. At first it was faint, a dry, rhythmic sound near her feet. Then it rose, sharp and menacing. She froze. The snake lay coiled beside a rock, its scales glistening like wet bronze, its head raised. Lydia's heart slammed against her ribs. She took a step back, but the ground gave way beneath her heel. She fell hard, pain lancing through her leg. The snake struck, fast as lightning. She felt the bite before she saw it. 2 burning points above her ankle. She screamed and crawled backward, clutching her leg. But the snake was gone. The pain spread fast, a fire under her skin. She tore a strip from her dress and tied it above the wound, gasping. The world spun. The sky tilted, blurred. She tried to stand, stumbled, and collapsed near the creek. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the cow's halter knife glinting in the mud. When she woke, she wasn't dead. She was inside a cabin, warm, dim, smelling of smoke and pine. A man sat beside the bed, his back to her, cleaning a rifle. The firelight flickered over his shoulders. He turned when she stirred, his face weathered but not unkind. "Easy," he said. "You're safe." Lydia blinked. Her leg throbbed, wrapped in clean cloth. Where am I?" "About a day's ride north of Dry Creek." His voice was low, steady. "Found you by the stream. Snakebite would have done you in if I hadn't come along." She tried to sit up, but the dizziness returned. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. His hands were rough, scarred, the kind of hands that had built and broken things. She drank, trembling. "Name's Jack Hollister," he said after a moment. "Used to soldier for the Union down in Texas. Been drifting since." He looked at her, waiting. "You got a name?" "Lydia," she said. Her voice cracked on it. "Lydia Crow." He raised a brow. "Crow, huh? That your kin or your husband?" She turned her gaze to the fire. "Husband." He didn't ask more, but his eyes narrowed slightly, catching what she didn't say. He nodded once and poked the fire with a stick. "You can stay till you're steady on that leg. Then I'll see you safe to town." "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. Crow's a name that carries trouble. The days that followed blurred together. Lydia slept, ate, and slowly regained her strength. Jack spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured, honest. He lived alone in that mountain cabin, surviving on what the land gave: deer meat, cornbread, coffee black as coal. There were scars across his arms and one running down his cheek. He carried himself like a man used to danger, but not ruled by it. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with lust or pity, but with quiet curiosity. He never asked what she'd run from. Maybe he already knew. The frontier was full of women running from something. On the 3rd evening, she stepped outside. The air smelled clean after rain, the sun bleeding red across the hills. Jack was fixing a fence nearby, his shirt sleeves rolled, sweat streaking his neck. "You shouldn't be on that leg yet," he said without looking up. "I needed air," she replied. "The walls make me feel trapped." He paused, drove another nail into the post. "Trap's a bad way to live." She watched him work, the rhythmic swing of the hammer. "You ever feel it?" "Every day," he said. "But I don't let it stay." His words lingered. Lydia looked toward the horizon. The faint smoke of the ranch she'd escaped rising miles away. Abel would be awake now, sober, furious. The thought made her blood run cold. "He'll come for me," she said softly. Jack set the hammer down. "Then we'd best be ready." The following morning, he handed her a rifle. "Know how to shoot?" She shook her head. "My father used to hunt, but he never let me touch a gun." "Well," he said, checking the chamber, "it's time you learned." He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to breathe steady before the pull. Her arms trembled under the weight, but she kept her eyes on the target. A tin can set on a stump. The shot rang out sharp and clean. She missed by inches. "Again," Jack said. She fired twice more, hitting the can on the 3rd try. The sound echoed through the trees, startling a crow into flight. Lydia smiled despite herself. Guess I'm not hopeless. No one is, he said quietly. They spent the next hours packing supplies, jerk meat, bullets, a flask of water. Jack's horse, a strong roan mare, snorted impatiently as he tightened the saddle. We'll head for the canyons by dusk, he said. Harder to track there. Track, she asked. He nodded toward the distance. Crow's men are out. Saw smoke by the creek an hour ago. 3 riders, maybe 4. Her pulse quickened. He won't stop. Men like him never do, Jack said. But he ain't the first bastard I put in the ground. That night, they rode to the low hills, the moon a pale scar overhead. The wind smelled of sage and smoke. Every sound carried, the creak of leather, the cry of a coyote. Lydia kept close behind Jack, her rifle strapped to her back, her heart hammering with equal parts fear and resolve. She wasn't the same girl who'd stood by the fence weeks ago. The fear was still there, yes, but now it moved beside something fiercer, a will to live on her own terms. By midnight, they reached a narrow canyon where the rocks rose like walls. Jack led the horse to water, then crouched, scanning the dark ridge above. They're close, he murmured. Can feel it. How? She asked. He looked at her, eyes sharp. Man, who hunt got a smell. Once you've been hunted, you don't forget it. They camped in silence. The fire was small, barely aglow. Lydia lay awake, listening to the night sounds, owls, crickets, the shifting of a horse. Her thoughts wandered to her parents. Were they alive? Did they know what they'd done? She didn't blame them as much now. Poverty made cowards of good people. Still, she couldn't forgive. Jack sat across from her, cleaning his revolver. His face was calm, but his eyes stayed on the shadows. She whispered, "Why'd you help me?" He shrugged. "Didn't seem right to let you die out there." "That's all." He looked at her a long time. "That's enough." The fire crackled softly. Lydia wanted to say more, to ask about his scars, his past, but sleep pulled her under before she could. She dreamed of thunder and hooves, of a river running red. At dawn, she woke to find Jack already standing, rifle in hand. "They found us," he said. Before she could speak, a gunshot tore through the stillness, echoing off the canyon walls. The horse reared, screaming. Jack fired back, crouching low. "Stay down," he barked. Lydia dropped behind a boulder, heart pounding, the air filled with dust and the sharp tang of gunpowder. She peeked out just long enough to see them. 3 men on horseback, one of them Abel Crow, his face twisted with rage. "Lydia," he shouted, "you think you can run from me? You're mine." The words hit harder than the bullets. Jack fired again, clipping one rider's hat clean off. The man cursed, turning his horse. "We gotta move." Jack yelled. He grabbed Lydia's arm, pulling her toward the rocks. They scrambled upward, the stones cutting their palms. Gunfire chased them, sparks flashing from the cliffside. A bullet grazed Jack's shoulder. He grunted but didn't fall. They reached a narrow ridge, hearts hammering. Below, the riders regrouped, their shouts echoing up the canyon. Lydia turned to Jack, breathless. He'll never stop. Jack's gaze was fierce, steady despite the blood on his arm. Then we don't stop either. As the sun rose behind them, turning the sky to fire, Lydia looked down at the men hunting her and felt something new burn in her chest. Not just fear, but defiance. She wasn't running anymore. She was surviving. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that she'd rather die free than live as property again. The dawn came with no warmth. Mist hung low over the prairie like the breath of ghosts, wrapping the cabin and the wounded man inside it in gray silence. Lydia sat near the embers of the dying fire, her hands trembling around a tin cup of cold water. Outside, the land waited, watchful and still, as if it knew the storm that would come before day's end. Ethan stirred on the cot. His bandaged shoulder bled through again, the crimson soaking the rough cloth. She moved closer, pressing her palm against the wound, and felt the weak pulse beneath the skin. He opened his eyes slowly, those gray-green eyes that had once belonged to a soldier, not a drifter. "Don't waste your strength," he muttered, voice rough from pain. "You should have kept riding." "And leave you to die out here?" she said. "No, I've seen enough dying. Ethan tried to smile, but it came out crooked. You got fire, girl. That's what keeps you alive out here. Fire and luck. She looked toward the window, where the light was still soft and uncertain. Luck's never done me much good. Neither spoke for a long while. The air smelled of damp wood and pine sap, and in the silence Lydia's thoughts spun like leaves in a gust. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Abel Crow's face, hard, sun-seamed, and full of the kind of hate that never cooled. She knew he would come. A man like that didn't lose what he thought he owned. She rose suddenly. I can't stay here. If he finds us, he'll kill you. Ethan pushed himself up with a groan. He'll find you no matter where you go. Men like him always do. You can't keep running forever. Then I'll stop running, she said, her voice steady but eyes glistening. But I won't go back to that house. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, streaks of gold cutting through the fog. Lydia packed what little they had, some dried meat, a blanket, Ethan's revolver, and tied the horse she'd taken from Crow to a tree. Ethan tried to stand but nearly collapsed. She caught him beneath the arm, her small frame steadying his weight. They left the cabin behind, following the narrow deer trail toward the river. The land was waking, hawks circling high above, a coyote call echoing from somewhere unseen. Every sound made Lydia flinch, but Ethan's calm steadied her. You were a soldier, she said quietly. You fight like one, talk like one too. He nodded. Fought for the Union down in Texas. Lost half my men and the rest of my soul. Been wandering since. She looked at him with something close to pity. And now you're bleeding for a girl you just met. He gave a short, dry laugh. Guess I never learned when to stop fighting. By midday, they reached the river, wide, fast, and muddy from the rain. Lydia stared at it, knowing it marked the edge of Crow's land. If they could cross, they'd have a chance. Maybe not a big one, but enough. Ethan eyed the water. You first. The horse can swim it. I'll follow. She hesitated. You're in no shape. Go, he said firmly. You get across, you don't look back. But she didn't move. Her fingers gripped the reins so tight her knuckles went white. The current roared in her ears like a warning. Then behind them came the distant thunder of hooves. Ethan turned, jaw tightening. He's coming. Through the trees they could see them. 3 riders, dark shapes cutting through the mist. Abel Crow led the pack, rifle raised, his black hat glinting like the wing of a crow. Ethan drew his gun. Go, Lydia. Now. She mounted, kicking the horse hard, the animal leaping into the churning river. Cold water bit her legs, rising higher as the current dragged her downstream. Behind her came the crack of a rifle and the sharp whine of a bullet. She ducked low, heart pounding. Ethan fired back, once, twice, before stumbling to his knees. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he kept shooting. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plains like thunder rolling from the heavens. Lydia reached the far bank, half drenched and gasping. She turned to see Ethan still on the shore, smoke rising from his revolver. Crow and his men close and fast. One of them fired. Ethan jerked, stumbled, but managed to send one of them off his horse before he went down hard in the mud. Ethan, she screamed. He didn't answer. Crow dismounted, striding forward with that familiar, cruel swagger. He looked across the river, eyes locking on Lydia. You think you can run from me, girl? He bellowed. You're mine. You always were. Lydia's chest heaved. You sold me, Abel. You sold me for a cow. He laughed, a deep, hollow sound. And you were worth less than that. She raised Ethan's revolver, hands trembling. Don't come any closer. Crow smirked. You wouldn't shoot. You're too soft. You ain't got the will. Her finger hesitated on the trigger. For a moment, she saw everything she'd lost, her family, her childhood, her peace, and everything she could still lose. Then another shot cracked. Crow staggered back, eyes wide, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. Ethan lay in the mud behind him, gun smoking in his hand. His face was pale, breath shallow, but he'd done it. He'd saved her. Crow dropped to his knees, cursing through blood before collapsing face first into the riverbank. The water carried him away slowly, swallowed by the same wilderness he'd ruled with fear. Lydia waded back across, fighting the current until she reached Ethan. He was barely conscious, eyes half open. She knelt beside him, cradling his head. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved me." He coughed, a thin line of blood at his lips. "You saved yourself. I just helped you see it." Tears streaked her face, mixing with the rain and river water. "Don't talk like that. We'll get you to a doctor. There's a town east." He shook his head weakly. "No town can fix me now. You just keep going. Don't look back." She pressed her forehead against his, the wind cold and merciless around them. "I can't leave you." "You can," he breathed. "And you will." His hand slipped from hers. His chest stilled. The world seemed to go quiet all at once. No wind, no birds, just the sound of the river carrying away the last echoes of violence. Lydia sat there for a long time, until the sun broke through the clouds, washing the land in gold. The light touched Ethan's face, soft and still, and for a moment he looked almost at peace. She whispered a prayer she barely remembered from childhood, then closed his eyes with trembling fingers. By evening, she'd buried him beneath a cedar tree overlooking the river. She used a flat stone for a marker and carved his name with the tip of his knife. Ethan Graves. He fought for someone else's freedom. When it was done, she stood in silence, the wind tugging at her dress. The horizon stretched wide before her, open and wild. She could go anywhere now. Yet every road felt heavy with the cost of her freedom. As she turned to leave, she saw something glinting in the dirt near his grave. It was his dog tag, worn and rusted, marked with the words 5th Cavalry. She slipped it around her neck. The metal was cold, but it steadied her. That night, Lydia made camp a few miles from the river. She built a small fire and sat watching the flames lick the dark. Each crack of the burning would reminded her of the rifle shots, the moment that split her old life from whatever came next. She thought of her parents then, how desperation had driven them to sell her, how fear had blinded them. Maybe they were victims too, in their way. Out here, everyone was just trying to survive. The stars stretched wide above her, and the wind carried the low cry of a coyote. She pulled Ethan's coat tight around her shoulders. The smell of him still clung to it, gunpowder, leather, and dust. Somewhere deep inside, the fire he had spoken of still burned. She didn't know where the trail would lead, north toward the settlements, maybe west toward California, but she knew she'd walk it alone, carrying his memory like a lantern through the dark. By the next morning, the river had gone still again. No sign of Crow's men, no trace of the blood that had stained the shore. Just the endless prairie, washed clean by rain. Lydia mounted the horse and looked back one last time at the cedar tree. The stone she'd placed there caught the light, shining faintly in the distance. She touched the tag around her neck, then spurred the horse forward. The horizon opened wide before her, a canvas of gold and gray. Somewhere out there would be a town, maybe a name she could take for herself. But she didn't need anyone to tell her who she was anymore. She rode on, wind tearing through her hair, tears drying on her cheeks. The land swallowed her silhouette until she was just another moving shadow across the plains, a survivor of the cruel trade that had tried to break her. And though the world would never know their story, the land would remember. The cedar tree would stand watch by the river, roots deep in the soil that held a soldier's bones and a woman's rebirth. In time, travelers might pass that way, find the carved stone, and wonder who Ethan Graves was. Maybe they'd pause, maybe they wouldn't. But the story would live on in the whisper of the wind and the restless heart of the prairie. For the frontier had a way of keeping its secrets, and of testing every soul that crossed its dust. And for those who survived it, like Lydia Holt, freedom was never given. It was taken, hard-earned, paid for in blood. Maybe that's what the land was teaching all along, that every bargain made in desperation leaves a scar, and every scar tells a story. So if you ever find yourself riding through that wild country where the river bends and the cedars grow tall, stop for a while. Listen. You might just hear it. The echo of a gunshot, a girl's cry, and the quiet voice of a man saying, "Keep going." And perhaps then you'll understand some hearts break so that others can learn how to keep beating.